Welcome to the Liberation Lab podcast, insights and interviews for the disruptive educator. I am honored to have my guest on this evening. So why don't you tell the people who you are, what you do, and why you do it?
Great to be here. Yo, that's a nice sweatshirt there too, brother. Let me just say
Hey,
that.
hey.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Good stuff. I did not know that he was wearing that, but that's I like it. I like it. This campaign is from our students, our high school students. Came up with this campaign during our one of our focus groups, and so, Sharif El-Mekki. I'm the founder and CEO at the Center for Black Educator Development. We're working on not only rebuilding the Black teacher pipeline, but introducing Black instructional techniques, strategies, frameworks that have always been used, but are often, ignored, or people just wholly unaware that Black educational theorists, Black behavior theorists have contributed massive amounts of just great pedagogy and great instruction and techniques in schools for hundreds of years. And so our work is to not only invite youth into the profession, but also to share what Black Educator Hall of Famers have been doing, and particularly in light of student outcomes and how they've been able to, over the years, achieve by leading classrooms and schools.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think almost like, so in my experience, right, I started in Camden. I was at a charter school in Camden.
For those who don't know, that's a suburb of Philly. You know what I mean? It's right over the
Yeah.
bridge.
It was
Yeah, right over
right
the
over.
bridge. Yeah.
Yeah, and even as I'm sitting here recording, like the Betsy Ross is literally right there, right? So like,
Oh, you still
this
there?
is where
Yeah.
I've been. So I've been in South Jersey for basically the entirety of my career. Taught in Camden, taught in Trenton, and I'm now serving in Willingboro. And I say that to as a backdrop for a larger discussion, which is when we think about the trajectory of you know where we desire our students to go. If we have any hope for where education can be, and I mean outside of the project of schooling, and I'm using that on purpose, I believe that reclaiming Black teaching is a big key to that. However, it's almost this lost ark relic somewhere over here that we don't know anything about. So, for somebody who's listening, has no idea what you're talking about, what do you mean Black, you know, practice, Black teaching, Black pedagogy? What is that? And why are you calling it Black?
Yeah, why you got Black in front of anything? That's it's interesting. So our good friend and scholar, Dr. Koso Lassane, did her dissertation on this idea of Black teaching traditions. So I'll use that term
Yes.
just as we're discussing it. And what that is are like, what are instructional practices that Black people have used to educate their children? How have Black communities looked at teaching and learning? And then how have they been codified? How have they been replicated, researched, studied, understood, and then passed on? And these are practices that aren't all, there's some originated in West Africa and maybe have
Mm-hmm.
been strained during the Middle Passage, but not broken and passed along across generations, right? And so these, whether it's how Marva Collins opened up a school for children that everyone had written off and said they were unable to be educated, and yet she educated them and did it superbly. If it's Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who not only started Black History Month, but was actually training teachers and principals
Mm-hmm.
how
Mm-hmm.
to teach and how to teach well. Fits the the codification of like what did Lucy Craft Laney, Nancy Helen Burroughs, Mary McLeod Bethune and others and many others designed 5,000 schools across the country. But then even more recently, what has Vanessa Siddle Walker been able to capture? What is Dr. Greg Carr? What has he been teaching for all these years? What did the notorious GLB, Gloria Ladson Billings, talk about? Like, hey, here's how you teach effectively. And so what we, posit is that these are Black teaching traditions, but they're really good for humanity, because we learn, everybody who's on the path to learn about education, learn how to be a teacher, principal, superintendent, later learn about European educational theorists, white American behavior theorist, white child psychologist, and then they're armed with that and only that to go
Hmm.
teach everybody else's children. And then year after year, decade after decade, we see like, wait a minute, the results are not where they should be. Kids are not
Hmm.
living up to their potential. Their aspirations are getting ground to dust.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
what's happening, right? And then we also see community educators who are using some of these Black teaching traditions outside of the schooling paradigm
There
and
it
doing
is.
it in the community because these are traditions that are passed along. This is why your auntie can stand in front of an entire congregation and know how to use eye contact, how to use proximity, how to use names,
Yes.
call the person by their name and their correct name. All of these things are just, a part of, okay, how do we surface the humanity of a child? How do we use joy and language and culture to inspire, right? Because teaching is not just passing a content, it's also inspiring the student. The
Mm,
one who studies
yeah.
because they're inspired, right? And that is part of the role of teaching that sometimes gets lost, often gets lost, and certainly not centered in many of the schools our children attend.
As you said that, I thought of a situation that happened to just today.
Mm,
I have a privilege of serving in a middle school, and one of my babies, I call them my babies.
mm-hmm,
They came to me in tears, upset at a situation that had happened in their classroom. And as she began to speak to me about what was happening, what became really apparent was not that she was just this obstinate child that didn't want to do, but that she didn't feel seen, valued, heard in the classroom. It was so frustrating to her that when she would ask for help on something, that the teacher would come and reread the problem and then walk away as if that was help, if that
mm,
was support. So now she's looking at something that she has fear in, right? In terms of math competency or feeling like she can do it. She reached out to the person who should have been giving her support. And now it furthers the divide between the access she can have to that learning, right? And so the thing that really came out was when I go in there, it ruins the rest of my day. Literally, that's what this child told me. And it seems as though we've kind of, and I think it's a very convoluted problem, but we have a lot of educators who are feeling the pressure and the weight and the practice of schooling. I'm using that on purpose. And now, as they are required to do all of these things to try to move the needle and do all the, they're getting burnt out or they're forgetting about this essential ingredient of joy in the classroom. Can you talk to us a little bit about why joy, one, is so important, but two, when we think about our Black babies coming into classrooms that are not designed for them, if we're being real, why is joy such an essential ingredient? How can it be used to help, support our babies?
yeah, a thing about it, and I'm only recently, started. I did not used to use the term joy,
Yeah,
back in, and I don't remember any of my teachers talking about joy, So I'll get there, but I want to rewind it a little bit. Like,
for
one of
sure.
the things that I just remember being a child in school and being in, amongst learners and the learned is that I never felt unloved.
Hmm.
And so, like, to me, that part, even when they had to discipline us, point us in the right direction, guide us, I never felt unloved. And I think that was such a critical part of the culture of the school. And
Hmm.
then I can also talk about, using the term joy, I can think about all the ways that joy was exhibited, even though they really looked at it as this is how you educate children.
Yeah.
Like it's back to
Yeah.
the inspiration, like you can't, it's hard to be in the depth of misery in your schooling experience and also experience joy.
Hmm.
But if you don't have that misery, if you feel, as you said, seen, loved, appreciated, heard, if your leadership skills are being poured into, if opportunities are pervasive, I think about the intergenerational model we had where, yeah, you know
Hmm.
what? Like we have the teachers, but yeah, the upper grades are supporting the younger grades and the younger grades are supporting the youngest grades. Like all of that just created a type of culture that continued to bring joy into the space, even though they weren't using, maybe they were using that term in the teacher's lounge and stuff. Like I had never heard it,
Hmm.
and then even as a nascent teacher, people weren't talking about it, but we understood like the connection between like what people are saying, like belongingness and feeling loved and valued to joy. Now, fast forward, like if we're talking like, just joy, like students should, like they should enjoy being in school, being not just amongst their peers, being amongst their educators, right? And so one of the things that, when I started teaching decades ago, it was around like, hey, how do we, one, center the youth and their experiences culturally, intellectually? How do they feel safe? Like that's how we were trained, by our coaches, was what are the structures and the culture to make sure that they feel safe? And a lot of times people just automatically think physically safe, like
Right.
emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, culturally safe. That brings about where the child can be themselves. They're not
Yes.
shrinking, they're not erasing themselves. They're like, I can be a child. Like, what does it mean to be safe? And people understand, like, oh, this is, even if you did something, that's within the framework of a child. Like, oh,
Yep.
this child made mistakes, and shouldn't school be a safe place to make mistakes? If you got your whole life ahead of you and you're trying to do all these things, and learning happens when there is some type of error, shouldn't it be safe? Whether it's a math problem or a behavior problem, I should experience like a level of safety to make that mistake and learn from it. So killing joy, whereas Dr. Bettina Love talks about spirit murdering,
Spirit
happens
murder.
when you can't, not only will you be ridiculed for making a mistake on the blackboard or the whiteboard, in your homework, but you also make a mistake socially, when those
Yeah.
should be like learning opportunities, and that's where the most rapid growth can.
I think about my journey, and I told you, earlier that I started in Camden. What I didn't share was I got out of my teacher prep program and very quickly learned that I was not prepared to teach. And so I get into the
You want to learn?
classroom, right? I get into the classroom and I am handed a book. And I was told this is what we are going to use to be able to instruct all the students because it's Camden. It looks like they look like me. They're black and brown babies, right? And it was teach like a champion. And for my first year and a half, because this is what I thought was supposed to be the thing that would help my the children that I cared about, I was this regimented drill sergeant that told like they were silent transitions and kids had to be in my classroom and in a seat in 30 seconds and they had to start their do now and if they didn't then there was a conversation and a reflection and a deduction and all of these things. And I look back on my first few years. Now I've been graced to still be connected to my first group of students that I ever taught. And every time I have the opportunity to talk to them, I apologize for
I
the
think most of us do. I
yeah,
think most of us, because what, it's not
yeah,
something you automatically come in and learn, and like what you said, being handed a book or being handed a curriculum, being handed without the coaching, mentorship,
yeah,
modeling,
yeah,
support. And when I say
yeah.
you're not alone, there's studies after studies after studies that show most teachers say, I'm not prepared to teach. And then when you add, dual language learners, if you add
Mhm.
poverty, if you add special needs, then that percentage of teachers who say they're not prepared after tens of thousands of dollars in in tuition,
Right.
years of study, and so that right there's something askew with our educator prep program
Yes.
across the country. And so that's a big part of it. But then also, like when we invite young folks to come lead classrooms, how are we supporting them in this space, and how are we building community with them? Because I think a big part of all of this is, how do we ensure that there's a sense of common purpose, right? And like that's
Mhm.
one of the things when I talk about like my elementary, particularly elementary and middle, but particularly my elementary school experience. It was this notion, this culture of, I'll be successful if you're successful, and you'll be successful if I'm successful. What's
Yes.
our shared sense of purpose? And then the line, people talk about home hyphen school. That hyphen can almost disappear in places like I went to elementary school. It's just home, school, school, home. It's such an alignment and
Yeah.
aspiration for the child in goals and techniques. All of those kind of things are so aligned that you're able to move faster. You're able to build a sense of community, and you have like a shared sense of purpose. Like all those things, really accelerate achievement. When you don't have those, when you have these fissures and chasms between how home thinks about that black child, that black
Hmm.
boy in the classroom, and how the school thinks about it. When there's that chasm, the child is again the one that suffers and is in the middle, is in that moat, so to speak. Is just really hard to achieve at the highest level. And then we didn't even get to the point of like actual instruction, where part of instruction is making sure that a student has a positive racial identity as well, positive sense of
Hmm.
self, whoever they are. They should feel,
Hmm.
and how much students talk about like, no, my experience in my school demoralized me. Like, you know,
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I was watching a video actually. It moved me to the point where I had to talk about it. But this brother was asked on the subway, "Hey, when did you first learn that you were black?" And he said it was in elementary school and somebody brought in a transformer and it was a rare limited edition transformer and it got taken. That the teacher and everybody in the class thought it was him, accused him, whatever have you. The next day, another student came in and had two of the same kind and they were very rare.
mm,
And and now he's like, oh, okay, I'm about to be vindicated. Everybody sees now. And he says that the teacher still pulled him aside and said, I know you have them. And I listen to that story and I think about the countless stories that are kind of embedded in that or have a similar understanding of themselves through the eyes of others. They come through the schooling process, they go to K to 12 education, and if they don't shrink, if they don't diminish, if they don't conform, if they don't almost pander to whiteness, then at that point they become this obstinate child that gets labeled and pushed out and run out of our schools. When I think about the antithesis of that, what is it that's going to help us shift that? Part of what you're talking about in terms of pedagogy, in terms of teaching practice, knowledge of self is a big key. And so, if I'm an educator listening to this conversation and I'm saying, you know what? I want to know a little bit more. What is it that you're talking about? Where could I start? What is a practical takeaway that I can use to kind of build this ability in myself to reach the black boys and girls in front of me?
yeah, I mean, there's so much out there
For sure.
today, but I would start where a lot of people started. So the new research, many of them grounded and pulled from the work of like a Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings.
Last
So
imbalance.
yeah,
Yeah.
I would start there, just so people can. And she has articles, YouTube videos, her books, new editions of her of
Books, yeah.
her
The remix.
material. Yeah, and so I
Yeah.
would, I would start there. Folks could also look at Lisa Delpit's work,
Mhm,
and so like
mhm,
really looking at how people talk about, school, education, learning, and which is, you know, I think the part that's most, frightful for me is that these pieces of like how to teach well are often done in silos. Hey, we're going to teach
mhm.
you content, and then we're going to do a hour of professional development on like how to support a child emotionally, or like whatever the term is. It's a million terms out there: cultural responsiveness, you know
Social.
it's social emotional development, da da da, all those kind of things. And the first thing people have to do is really examine their own mindset. How do I think about this community, and why? Who taught me that?
Mhm,
Where did I learn that from, and why? That story that you mentioned about the alleged theft. Like I remember intervening as a teacher leader, where a teacher was accusing this child of stealing money from her, and I had to intervene and say, like, did you see? Like, no, but I know he did it. Like why? Well, he's always in trouble. But what? But like what? Like why are you accusing? I mean, so adamantly. This woman found her pocketbook in her the closet because I was just like, let's can you just retrace your steps? This is a huge accusation that you're making this child. This child doesn't understand why he's even, accused. And she found her pocketbook, but like because she couldn't even examine. So then we had to talk about like you have biases against this child.
Hmm.
You misplaced, and yet your first thing was like, who's the child? Like, so that's a level of bias that you have, and you can't think for 1 second that doesn't impact your teaching and his learning,
Yes.
because those biases
Yes.
creep in before you arrive to the doorsteps of the school and classroom. Before you're in front of that classroom, how you're planning your lesson, your biases are seeped in.
Yes.
What are you
Yes.
teaching? What are you pulling from? Who are you going to call on? What resources are you using? What level of questioning? All of the things. What connectivity are you going to bring that makes it more relevant? All of that can be informed or hindered by biases. And when you add, and again, people talk about bias, they automatically think I'm not a racist. First of all, biases is a human psychological term, and
Right.
everyone has them. The
Yes.
job of an educator is to excavate the biases, examine, identify, examine, excavate to make sure they don't hinder the teaching and learning. But too many
Yeah.
people want to ignore that and just say, no, I love our kids. Well, the outcomes don't say that.
Thank
The
you.
student, the child's experiences that they're sharing doesn't say that. And we hear this. Look, even recruiting, we worked with Teach Plus to interview, to write a report based off of interviews of students who were already interested in becoming teachers. They were also asked, what gives you pause? You want to be a teacher, but what gives you pause? They talk about their own experiences as students.
Hmm.
They talk about how they see educators of color being treated in their school. People think they don't notice, but they do notice. They see it,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? And I
Hmm.
remember there was some students who we were again, were speaking to, and some of them said, I want to be a teacher, but I would not want to be the colleague of some of my current teachers. So I want to join this profession, but based off of how some of my current teachers act and treat us students, me and my peers, I wouldn't want to be a colleague of theirs. I'll be a teacher, but I want to be somewhere else. Where some of them are like, oh yeah, I want to return to my school. I want to lead in the same place. Oh, here's my, and they're like, no, no, no. I want to join this profession, but not with them.
Well,
That's damning.
it's so interesting to hear that, right? And from folks who are already convinced that they want to be a part of this wonderful profession, because it makes me think of, like, practically speaking, when you look at any other industry, any other space and place, you would look at the numbers, the data of success to them, right? What needs to be done to improve, so on and so forth, right? If there were the same rates in your favorite restaurant in terms of the meal production, the clientele liked it or didn't like it, and the numbers look similar to what we're seeing in school, there are folks who wouldn't go back to that
Who
restaurant.
left sick?
Right.
Who left
Who
sick? And how many of
who
us
was
leave
harmed?
school? Yeah.
And we continue to go to the school, and we continue to funnel money and do all the things, but it seems to me that there is this propensity in our teaching and in humanity. I'm going to say it that way. In humanity, and anytime that there's something like this brought up, when it's a successful story, man, look at how well that came together, and worked hard for that, so on and so forth. And when it's a story that gives us pause or has us to kind of reflect or think differently, we will point away from ourselves and say, well, the community, well, poverty, well, all these things. And I'm not saying that those things don't affect teaching. I'm not saying that at all, but I wonder, why is it an excuse or a reason to why we can't get kids over the barriers that have deliberately set up in this experiment called America? Why is that? And I guess what that brings up for me is when we think about levels of accountability, change, and particularly amidst this backdrop of the last, where are we at? February 4th, you know, of the current administration and looking forward, I really feel like it's gut check time for us. Like, are we going to be courageous? Are we going to, in the presence of all the fear that we might have, still stand up for what's right because we have babies in front of us who are depending on it? And I wonder about that, particularly in our schools, but also I think that lends itself to the work that you're doing. So could you kind of speak to that for us a little bit here in terms of just this backdrop and of the current administration and where we have to go?
Yeah, look, Mark Twain said that, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And I
Hmm.
would say there's a rhyming that's happening. So one, I would say
Seen it before.
we've seen some of this before. Maybe not at this kind of chaotic maelstrom of, executive orders and recants and, the bluster and all of that simultaneously. But we've seen some of this before. We know. I remember again back to my elementary school
Hmm.
was when Ronald Reagan announced his presidency. He was running for presidency, and I remember we did a exercise. Our teachers, because their big thing was about critical thinking, understanding history and the future. And at that time, we didn't know like what the future was. Looking back, and they say life is best understood looking backwards. So looking backwards and understanding how much our teachers poured into this idea of us being critical thinkers and highly literate. So we had to analyze and explain why would Ronald Reagan announce his run for the presidency of the United States in Philadelphia, Mississippi. What was his purpose? Who was he trying to connect with? Who was he, what happened in Philadelphia, Mississippi, not too, much earlier that would be, and, he talked about, like just what is the theme of something and why, how much attention would someone put in a place that they announce their presidency, right? Like, and so we're going through all this and we actually have to do all this reading and discuss with our table and then come up with presentations or just thought hypotheses of like, why would somebody announce it and who are they, was it to, connect with oppressed people, in America, people who were marginalized, people who were not centered, or others, right? And so, like, just going through those kind of, exercises throughout, which is again just critical thinking. And
Critical thinking.
I remember
Yeah.
the teacher never said what they thought. They were just like, "What about this? What about?" They were just asking questions, and us having materials to discuss, digest, and so I think also think about like educators over the course of history, and again, back to one of my favorite kind of I guess value or framework or competency that these Black Educator Hall of Famers brought to bear was like this idea of ethics of care.
Hmm.
And not just for their children, not just for Black children. I'm a Black teacher and it's for Black children. It's for humanity, as you mentioned
Yes.
earlier.
Yes.
And then, and just, some people are like, oh, it's not just that Black teachers care about. I'm like, no, that's true. That's not what we're saying at all. But we're saying this is a grounding principle of, of their value system.